The state of Indiana has a rich Native American Indian history, which includes a number of indigenous tribes and traditions that date back long before we became the Hoosier state. In fact, the name itself, Indiana, means land of the Indians. With that said, the local Native American population remains very active here in Indiana, despite often being overlooked in regards to social concerns. Today, we're here in the esteemed Eiteljorg Museum in downtown Indianapolis, where we'll sit down with representatives from the Native American community to shed some light on some of the issues that are impacting them on this episode of One Indiana.
Focus on education as a big picture.
One time is too many times.
Populations have certainly changed.
Maintaining this misconception breeds
Help us
discrimination.
in the fight to provide equal opportunity.
People are getting the services that they need.
We must remove the man-made barriers we have.
Really just trying to eliminate discrimination from the state.
This is One Indiana, and
We are all Hoosiers.
Hello, and welcome to One Indiana. I'm your host, Jamal Smith, and we're here in the Eiteljorg Museum of American Indians and Western Art. We want to thank the wonderful staff here at the Eiteljorg for allowing us to film in their beautiful facilities. Joining us on set today to discuss the Native American community in Indiana are Kerry Steiner, Executive Director of the Indiana Native American Indian Affairs Commission, and Scott Shoemaker, Thomas G. and Susan C. Hoback, Curator of Native American Art, History, and Culture. Kerry and Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, Scott, I'd like to start with you. Long title. Tell our viewers a little bit about what it is that you do, and in particular, some of the things that the Eiteljorg is involved in as it relates to the Native American community.
Yeah, I do a lot of things as a curator here, working with the vast collections that the museum has collections of Native nations from all over North America. And a lot of that is in dealing with creating exhibits and overhauling the exhibit space, which we're currently in, which I just started a couple months ago. And so I have a vision of kind of transforming some of what we do in terms of educating the general public about Native nations all over North America, and then also building upon what the museum has done in terms of educating about Native peoples of Indiana.
So as a curator, and we have many folks who, both young and old, who are watching our show, give folks some background about what specifically a curator does, one who collects, but give us a definition, school us if you will.
Well, a curator is I wear lots of different hats kind of through that, and so I work a lot with the collections in terms of doing research on what we have in the collections. There's a lot of things that were collected over the past that sometimes the people that collected them didn't necessarily record the necessary information that we have about all the different cultural contexts in which the objects were used. And doing more research on that, connecting with Native communities and artists, in terms of looking at Native voice and Native interpretations of those.
Yes.
Developing a lot of things that are a part of exhibits. So the Eiteljorg does kind of some different exhibits that touch upon different subjects. So the current one right now is about gold and the gold rushes. And so there's Native people are a part of that story too. And so a lot of the things that I deal with is the content of Native peoples, with not only just within the Native galleries, but then the other parts of the museum as well.
And Kerry, similar to Scott, you have not too long been at the helm as the Executive Director of the Native American Affairs Commission. Why don't you give our viewers a little bit of insight about who you are and how you became the ED of the Commission?
So I feel very fortunate, Jamal, to have this opportunity to serve the indigenous people in this state. I have done volunteer work in this community since 2008, doing newsletters and social media and websites and things like that. And I've been involved in the Native community since 1992 when I attended my first gathering, a powwow up in Lebanon. So I've had an opportunity to meet a lot of people, and I feel like over the 20-something years, I've been able to acquire an appreciation for their history and their culture, and hopefully now this opportunity is going to present me a way to help make some great changes at the state level.
Yeah. And as we talk about our Native American community here in the state, there's obviously some will, if you will, so for folks to be connected to the Native American community. Scott, you have some connection as well. Why don't you give our viewers a little bit of insight about your connection to not just the museum, but to our Native folks here in Indiana?
Yeah, I'm a citizen of the Miami Nation of Indiana, and my family is the Mishinga Band. And from the oral history in our family, we've continuously lived in Indiana along what is the Mississinawa River since about the 1750s.
So joining the museum was kind of a welcoming home for you.
It is, yeah. I was born and raised in Kokomo and lived in Chicago for a while, then Minnesota, and so now I'm back in Indiana.
Here, back home.
Yeah.
So we mentioned the Miami tribe. How many tribes are there in the state of Indiana?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, that Indiana's comes from the term land of the Indians, and early on this area was very much a refuge for lots of other Native nations, like the Delaware that moved from the East Coast, and kind of as colonization was pushing tribes, that this became a real haven for a lot of different tribes. And so there was a period in kind of the 1830s to 1840s where the federal government wanted to remove tribes. And so through that process, a lot of those tribes were removed to Kansas and later Oklahoma. But my ancestors, what became the Miami Nation of Indiana, had congressional and treaty exemptions from removal. And then the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi also had treaty exemptions from removal. So we're the two tribes that stayed here in Indiana. And there's a lot of people that have moved back from other tribes that currently live in the state.
So you mentioned those are two of the indigenous tribes. Kerry, what are some of the other represented tribes here in the state?
WIA, the Delaware, the Upper Kispoco Band Shawnee. There's the Kickapoo, I believe, were also found in this area, probably like Scott was saying, when a lot of the tribes were being moved from the east toward the west and then further south. So,
yeah. And when you mentioned located here, in what parts of the state do we see some of the focal point of the concentration of our native folks?
I think we're going to find our biggest concentration probably the South Bend area for the Pokagon Potawatomi, Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. Fort Wayne has a pretty high population, which is going to be your Miami, a lot of that. Interestingly enough, when you look at the 2010 census, you'll find a pretty large pocket of people. The census says over 500 and under 1,000 in Hamilton County, north of Indianapolis, and Johnson County, south of Indianapolis. And there's a couple of smaller pockets down near Evansville and New Albany area.
Yeah. And so, if you've taken the head of the Native American Commission, identifying the tribes is arguably one thing. I'm sure. For those of us out there who are not as educated on the Native communities or Native American affairs, what are some of the misconceptions that the Commission is aiming to get rid of?
Well, that is a big question, and certainly we have some tasks ahead of us on that area. I think I would probably use this as a great opportunity to segue to our background, for example, that, and Scott can maybe elaborate on this a little bit more with his curator knowledge, but not all Indians lived in teepees. There's longhouses, there's wigwams, there's, Eskimos obviously didn't live in any of those kind of housings. So there's those kind of misconceptions. Some of it, and with no ill intention, happens in the schools where myths and misnomers are taught at an early age. Things about the accurate story of the first Thanksgiving versus the true story of the first Thanksgiving. Those kind of things. Mascots are an issue. So there's quite a few stereotypes that still exist. And
and I want to touch on some of the stereotypes and some of those issues, but in terms of misconceptions, we talk about the TP, and I'm sure there are a myriad of similar misconceptions as a curator you come across. So Scott, you want to kind of expound on some of that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is that there's this misconception that Native people only exist in the past, that our culture and who we are today is not authentic, isn't real in some way. And so that's one of the things that we really work on here in the museum, is trying to dispel some of those conceptions that Native peoples are alive and have a dynamic culture, and that it's very much rooted in the past, but there's also things that have changed over time.
Of course.
It's not exactly the same as it was, and neither is American.
Right.
You know, what is American culture, and
Yeah.
what, you know, it's not the same as it was in 1776,
Yeah.
but it's still American.
Well, you know, and it's funny. I liken it to as a black male, an African American male. There's tons of things that exist within our culture, and it's interesting to me that, you know, I'll get questions from folks about, you know, what is black culture, what is African American culture, as if I speak for everybody black,
Right.
right? Which is obviously not the case. There's a ton of diversity just within our culture alone, as well as it is, I'm sure, in the native culture. Looks are one thing. For example, you know, we black folks tend to come in an array of colors, and as I sit and I'm looking at you, Scott, I don't think the average guy who walks up is going to say, you know, whether you know, misinformed or uneducated or not, going to say, I think you're Native. Right? So that has to fit in some of what I would consider to be some of the miseducation, if you will. I mean, you know, what do you say to those who haven't been accurately taught about the Native culture and the people who make up our Native American community?
Yeah, that's something I've been dealing with my entire life, and something that I have a lot of responsibility that I feel, not just in terms of my position within the Miami community, but then as a curator here. Yeah. And it took me a while to kind of craft a response when people would say, "Really, you don't look like an Indian? How much Indian are you?" That's kind of the general kind of question, and you know, it took me a while to kind of come up with the response that. I'm a member of or a citizen of a sovereign nation, and as sovereign nations, we determine who we are. And we've always married outside. Before Europeans came, we married people from other tribes, either through adoption or these sorts of things where we brought new people in. And then when Europeans and African Americans and other people started coming in, we started marrying them too. And so that's a tradition for us, and you know, especially in terms of sort of the history. I guess people not understanding that history of violence that was perpetuated upon Native peoples, and the epidemics that we dealt with, and just the huge population loss, especially during the 19th century. That, like I mentioned, that my ancestors, we had, when removal happened, about 300 Miami remained in Indiana. Within about a couple generations, we all married each other. And so we kind of exhausted the amount of people we can marry within the community, so we had to marry outside if we wanted to survive.
And that touches on a history lesson, and Kerry, we're going to take a break here in a minute, but I want to get back to what I consider to be the miseducation as it relates to what our young people are taught in schools. Again, as a black man in America, and with the young kids, myself, I'm particularly interested in what kids are taught as it relates to history, right, and what actually happened. We're going to touch on that when we come back now, but we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we'll continue our discussion about the local Native American Indian community. This is One Indiana.
It's important that we show our culture, to share that pride that we have as a Native people, and to share that with other people, to show that we're still a vibrant people as we were 500 years ago, and to know that we're going to still be here 500 years from now.
Children.
The story of civil rights in Indiana is a long and often stormy one that in general reflects the issues faced in other states and in the nation at large. The idea of civil rights was a foreign concept for centuries in the United States. The state of Indiana was no different. Founded in 1816, the Hoosier State's original constitution prohibited slavery. However, there was nothing in Indiana's constitution that addressed the issues of discrimination or pushed equality. However, change was on the horizon. Much like federal and state legislation following the Civil War, acts and amendments did not change the attitudes of the people. It took the community demanding for equal rights. National Civil Rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was integral in the passing of Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964. Strong community activists throughout the state were vital in advocating for civil rights and electing Governor Matthew Welsh as Indiana governor in 1960. As chief executive of Indiana in 1961 through 1965, Governor Welsh actively worked to remove discrimination wherever possible. Several executive orders issued during his time in the State House gave increasing enforcement powers to the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. The Indiana Civil Rights Commission, originally named the Fair Employment Practices Committee, officially began operating on July 1st of 1961. Through subsequent legislation and executive orders, the Commission expanded in 1963 to include the enforcement of Indiana civil rights laws under the leadership of the Commission's first director, Harry Hatcher. The Commission jurisdiction continued to expand over the next 10 years. Housing was added in 1965 and gender discrimination in 1971. 3 years later, discrimination granting credit was added to the agency's jurisdiction. Subsequently, individuals with disabilities were added as a protected class in 1975. Recent legislation has continued to modify and expand the role of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. In 1991, the legislature amended the Indiana Civil Rights laws to comply with the enforcement provisions of the Federal Fair Housing Act. These amendments expanded the protections for Hoosiers by extending coverage for families with children and individuals with disabilities. As the Indiana Civil Rights Commission continues its mission of eliminating discrimination in the state, they will face many challenges. Among these are properly identifying and addressing the civil rights issues of today. The fabric of the ICRC has long been formed by its people. Countless people have served the Commission over the years, but share one thing: a commitment to serving the residents of Indiana. Help the Indiana Civil Rights Commission continue to meet its mission of ensuring all Hoosiers are treated equally, something we all need to stand for. After all, we are all Hoosiers.
So welcome back to One Indiana. We're here in the Eiteljorg Museum, where we've been discussing some of the efforts and affairs of the Native American Indian population here in Indiana, as well as some of the pertinent issues they face. So Kerry, when we left off, we were touching, Scott gave us a really good kind of insertion, if you will, into a history lesson, what I like to say. And right before he spoke, you mentioned some of the things that young people are being taught in school. Just continuing with this topic of miseducation, you talked about the dress. We talked about Thanksgiving, and I'm assuming then that addressing some of the education matters is one issue that the commission is going to be tackling. What are some of the other objectives or goals that the commission has set forth in its as it's being because a lot of folks don't know the commission existed, went defunct for quite some time, and excited to say that now it's back up and running. So, in light of that, there's obviously a plan, some things that you want to tackle. The miseducation is one of them. What are some of the other topics?
I think we have 5 focus areas, and of course we can entertain just about any subject that's brought up to our attention. But education, employment, health, housing, and civil rights are the basic 5 study groups. Okay. And we are able to address situations that come up in those areas at a local level, a state level, and a federal level. We'll make recommendations and hopefully help provide solutions, programs, events, and things to turn some of those around. So, Native American health disparities, there are particular things like diabetes that run prevalent in the Native American community, at a higher rate than other populations. Another one that's I think pretty big on our scope right now is along the employment lines, trying to help with job placement and job opportunities, education at college level, and we're talking about either creating or adding to a scholarship so that Native American students who are residents of Indiana that are attending attending an Indiana college or university can have a scholarship opportunity. We're looking at maybe get into some topics that are a little controversial, but mascots that exist at some of the schools in Indiana. The use of some derogatory language, again, maybe unintentional, but words that we, culturally speaking, there are a lot of words that people are sometimes raised hearing that are not acceptable or appropriate or should not be tolerated.
Yeah.
So.
And so some of those things that you mentioned before are commonplace, right? Regardless of where folks come from, white, black, native, you name it. Education disparities, health disparities, unemployment. Those are kind of commonplace. But then there's some cultural specific things that you mentioned that you're tackling. Now there's obviously, I think, what goes along in the category of miscommunication, right? Is the idea that and some of the concerns I know popped up when the commission came back to life was they're just going to discuss casinos and gambling and reading some of the statute that is something that the commission can and will not be discussing. Speak on that to kind of break the silence, if you will, to those who think that the premise of why the commission was created was to strategically come up with ways for Native Americans to be more involved in the gaming and casino arenas.
Well, it's clearly outlined in the statute that those are things we're not supposed to discuss, which really, sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, and the gaming issues are not to be discussed or addressed by the commission. Really, if you look at the mission statement, it speaks for itself. The socioeconomic, the cultural, educational opportunities, improving the everyday lives of the Native American people in this state is really the goal and the focus of the commission. And again, it comes back to those 5 study areas. And we just recently, we've broken down now into subcommittees for each of those. And so some of our subcommittees have met. Our civil rights subcommittee met actually at the Indiana State Prison a couple weeks ago and held our meeting there and did it by conference call, so the public is always welcome to join in either our subcommittees or come to our meetings.
Yes, I think that's important to note.
It is very important
to know. It's a public, it's a state commission.
Sure.
Meetings are public.
Yep.
Public is encouraged to be involved, of course.
And not only encouraged, I think it's almost, if I may say, a responsibility. I mean, in order to, we as a commission, the 17 of us can only do so much. So we need to have the input, we need to have ideas, we need to have involvement and participation from the public. This commission exists, this is their commission. We can sit around and talk about things all day, but that's where we're going to get our input and our feedback and our ideas, and welcome volunteers at any time, and try to help make things better.
From the better, yeah. So and ideally, I'm a true believer in collaboration and partnership, right? In a day and age where budgets are scarce and resources are limited, partnerships are key. This is obviously a beautiful relationship between the commission and the Eiteljorg. Yes. Scott, speak to the benefit of such a partnership here in the state of Indiana, and how the partnership or the collaboration can help the voice of some of the Native concerns be heard, some of those things that are not being addressed or perhaps have not been given a platform to be discussed.
Yeah, I think that really does touch upon just sort of the those issues of Native peoples being invisible and being of the past, and that sort of the issues of current issues for Native peoples is not something relevant. And I think that the museum and things like the State Commission really bring to the surface, or can bring to the surface, a lot of those things to educate the general public about, and really build support for those.
Yeah, and Kerry, you mentioned obviously encouraging and almost placing a responsibility on the general public to be involved with the commission. how would they do so? You mentioned jumping obviously on conference calls, but how else can one get involved in what the commission has going on?
Well, there's lots of ways to reach us. I mean, we have our website, which is www.in.gov/INAIAC. They can contact us there. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. Our public meetings, our subcommittee meetings are done by conference call, and those are always posted on the website with the call-in number. And
so the dates and times of places,
yes,
of all
location.
the meetings, locations, all those things are posted on the website. And that website, one more time,
is www.in.gov/ the initials for our commission, which is INAIAC.
Awesome. And Scott, obviously the museum is open pretty much daily. Obviously gorgeous and beautiful with tons of history and things engaged. What are some of the things that the museum has going on? How would the public find out about it? And is there something in particular you'd encourage the general public to be aware of?
You can visit the museum's website, and there's lots of things going on. Especially, I highly encourage people to come and visit the Indian market, which is just a very dynamic and wonderful event here just at Military Park, just on the north side of the canal here from the museum, which is June 27th through 28th.
Okay.
And there's native artists from all over North America that come, and they're some of the best, and people can purchase their art.
Nice.
And yeah, it's a really great event. It's not just the art. There's other.
And the dates on that again?
June 27th and 28th.
June 27th and 28th, and so we encourage everyone to come out and be a part of that. Kerry and Scott, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
it, Jamal.
It's been a pleasure, and certainly hope that our viewers got a lot out of it, and I hope this is not the last time we are able to have this conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's great to hear about the work that's being done within the Native American community. I'd like to thank both of our guests, Kerry and Scott, for joining me today, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. We often hear about the affairs of different minority populations throughout Indiana and the nation, but rarely is the Native American Indian population included in those discussions. So as we heard here today, their community faces common issues such as education, health, employment, etc., as well as many unique issues regarding misconceptions. It is important that we continue to ensure that all Hoosiers' efforts are being recognized and issues are being addressed. Again, I'm your host, Jamal Smith, reminding you that we are all Hoosiers. For more information about the Indiana Civil Rights Commission or any of our guests here today, visit us online at www.in.gov/ICRC or give us a call at 1-800-628-2909. And we'll see you next month on One Indiana.